Knowing your mom is abusive now, how is that different from when you thought that you knew that your dad was abusive back then? I'm sure that there's a lot of research you could find about this, but here's what it's like for me having lived through both being alienated from my dad for 20 years and now being estranged from my mom.
My name is Maddie, and welcome back to the Anti-Alienation Project, or welcome if you're new here. Here I talk about all things related to a certain type of severe child psychological abuse that I went through for 20 years, but not many people even know what it's called or how devastating it truly is for the child. This is currently called parental alienation. What is parental alienation? Ultimately, parental alienation is when one parent, usually a really angry parent, manipulates their child and goes on an obsessive rampage to destroy their child's relationship with their other parent. And they do this by manipulating the child to reject their other loving parent without true justification. This happened to me, and I rejected my dad for 20 years without true justification. So now I speak out about this, and I'm hoping to inform other people, get it on the public's radar, and form a group of former alienated children to come together and fight this together. I also am rebuilding my relationship with my dad and working on my own healing journey. When you're an alienated child, you don't know you're being manipulated. You usually believe that all of the decisions and beliefs you have about your bad parent are truly your own beliefs and decisions. Me, for example, I thought I was just estranged from my dad for 20 years. I didn't even know it was wrong for one parent to convince their child their other parent was bad, abusive, or unloving, but it is, obviously. So now in the comments, sometimes people wonder, and I get questions like, what is the difference between those 20 years when you believed your dad was this monster and abusive versus now knowing the truth and knowing that your mom is actually the abusive one? So I have a few answers to this question that I talked about in the live chat on Sunday. And so many members of the channel actually requested that I make that part of the live chat public so that people could learn from it. So these are just from my personal experience. My two disclaimers are always, number one, I'm not an expert. I'm not a therapist, researcher. I'm just someone who's lived through this from the child's point of view for 2 decades. 2 decades too long, by the way. And number two, the other disclaimer is that I don't speak for all alienated children. This is my experience, but it's not everybody's experience. So
Let's start with my dad. Believing my dad was abusive. The first difference between knowing that my mom is abusive and believing that my dad was abusive is that when I was believing my dad was abusive and bad and didn't love me and all these things, starting as a child, there was a third party involved, which was my mom. But that belief that I developed about my dad, I was really manipulated to believe it. I never would have come to that belief on my own. That was a belief that was put into me. And knowing my mom is abusive has been something that no one has told me, not even my dad, but I had to come to that conclusion on my own. So it's entirely my own decision. There are more differences than that, though. Believing that my dad was abusive, it started when I was a child, around the age 7 or 8 during their marriage is when it began. With my mom, I wasn't able to use the word abuse in relation to my mom until about 6 months after I had already learned about parental alienation. Admitting to myself that my mom has mistreated and abused me has been something that has been so hard to wrap my mind around and to accept. Um, so hard. Another really big difference that could help people who are trying to understand if they're justifiably estranged from a parent or if they're alienated, in my point of view, could be what happens in your life, what happens with yourself, your emotions, your personality, what happens to you, and what are the effects in your life when you go no contact with them. Because for me, I was alienated from my dad and consistently had periods of no contact, but no contact never helped me heal. In fact, when I figured out what parental alienation was, I was in a period of no contact with my dad, and I had made that last ditch effort to go no contact with him just because I was hoping maybe then I'll get better. No. So if you have an actually abusive parent, though, and you do no contact, in general, you should notice a lot of positive effects in your life, in your thoughts, in your emotions, in your world. And these probably will be mixed with a lot of negative emotions too. But in general, over time, maybe years, maybe months, or maybe years, you will find that you have been detoxed. Not so when you're alienated. You just keep having the same problems, more and more problems. Another thing about my mom being abusive or my dad, and how I know now alienation versus estrangement, is that talking to my dad about all of my emotions, my experiences, confronting him about things, he has taken accountability. He even takes accountability sometimes for things that I don't think he needs to take accountability for. Whereas my mom, when I confronted her, tried to talk to her about things that um, that she's actually done to hurt me, there was zero accountability. So that's another thing, the difference between alienation and estrangement. Often the alienator will not take accountability. Your targeted parent will. Not only when I look back at my life and how I came to reject my dad and believe all of these horrific things about him, the evidence was hearsay. The evidence was given to me through a third party. It wasn't stuff that I saw with my own eyes or heard with my own ears. It was hearsay. Whereas looking back with my mom, there are heaps of evidence, too much evidence, a lot of evidence. But what I was getting at is the last point, maybe the most important point. The whole time I was alienated from my dad, I didn't feel guilt for rejecting him. And now that I've done the research, I know that there's a psychological phenomenon for this that explains what happened in my little childish brain, my childlike brain, is that splitting mechanism where the child is in such a bad situation, such an abusive, scary situation, as the survival mechanism, they split off from that parent. And that's the only way I can describe the alienation and why I didn't feel guilty, because I didn't feel guilty. I didn't. In fact, I thought that by rejecting my dad and by not going with my dad, I really believed I was standing up to injustice because I really believed he was bad, abusive, unloving, etc. Whereas now, with my mom, you would think that maybe I'd have a lot of anger a lot of the time, or maybe it would be easy for me to not have a relationship with her. No, on the contrary, I've felt every emotion I think a human can experience. There's been tons of sadness. It is a very difficult grieving process, and I felt a lot of guilt for not letting her be in my life, for rejecting her, not to mention speaking out publicly. Tons of guilt. So I've even talked to my friends who have also been through alienation, and I was talking to them about this. Isn't it weird? I said, isn't it weird how while we were alienated, at least for me, I didn't feel that guilt about how I was treating my dad or rejecting my dad until I realized what that I was being abused and I was being manipulated. Then I felt a tsunami of guilt. But with my mom, who's actually treated me very poorly and actually abused me in many ways, why is it that I feel guilty for for not letting her abuse me anymore? It's just so confusing.
Thank you for watching. I hope that you found it insightful or helpful in some way. If so, please leave me a comment. In the comment section always generates a really interesting and helpful discussion for a lot of people. As always, please give this video a thumbs up to get it in the algorithm, and subscribe, hit the notification bell so you're notified whenever I post a new video. Hope you guys are having a good summer. I'll talk to you later. Bye.